Today on Quick Nuggets, we're going to look at a very interesting project. It's a range slider using the Next.js framework. If that's something that you're interested in creating, stay with us. All right, guys, we're going to use the Next.js framework to create our range slider application. So in our terminal, we go ahead and create our application by typing npx create next app, and we'll go ahead and tag along our application name, which is range slider at the end. Now this will install React, React DOM, and the Next dependency. Next.js will then install for us the dev dependencies, ESLint, and ESLint config. At this point, our barebone Next.js application has been created. We can now change directory or CD into our range slider folder. Let's go ahead and explore our application. In our range slider folder, we have our node modules installed. And in the pages folder, we have the API folder, which we can go ahead and delete, since in this project we won't be using APIs. And then we can go to our style, where we can go ahead and remove the home module style sheet, since we're going to be using Tailwind. Now let's go to index.js file, where we can do some cleanup. So let's go ahead and remove the import image and the styles, since it's no longer needed because we're using our Tailwind CSS, right? Let's go ahead also and clean up the HTML between the main tags. So we can go ahead and delete that. Finally, we could go ahead also and remove the HTML between the footer tags. Okay, that looks about right. Okay, let's go ahead and change our application title from Create Next App to Range Slider App. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create a h1 tag. And within our h1 tag, we want to type some text so that we can view in our browser. So let's go ahead and type hello world. Okay, good. Next, what we want to do, we want to remove some of the styles, seeing that we are no longer accessing the style sheet. We're going to be using Tailwind CSS to style our components. So let's remove that style, and let's remove this one in the footer also. And let's go ahead and remove this one right up here. We're removing container, right? Let's go ahead and add a Tailwind CSS class to our main container. This class will cause our text to be yellow. But before we actually run our application, we first need to install Tailwind CSS as a dependency. So we are installing Tailwind along with Post CSS and Auto Prefixer. Okay, our installation is complete. Next, we run npx Tailwind CSS init -p, so we can go ahead and configure our Tailwind. In our tailwind.config.js file, we can go ahead and configure the paths to the pages and the component directory. where our Tailwind components would reside. And here we could go ahead and enable the JIT compiler. At this point, we can go ahead and close our tailwind.config file. Let's go ahead and open up our global.css file. And at this point, we can go ahead and select all the content within that file. And we can go ahead and delete it. Then we can include the Tailwind base classes. We then go to our terminal where we type npm run dev. Let's see if we have anything on our screen. Yes, so we have hello world, so that means everything is working fine and we can start building our component from now. All right, let's make sure that our Tailwind is working. We change the text to red, and yes, we can see here it shows up red. So right now we can go ahead and start building our range slider. Let's go ahead and open up our file panel. And within our file panel, we'll create a folder named components. And that components folder is where we'll store our slider component. Next, we'll go in our index.js file and remove the footer, since our focus will be mainly on the slider component. So we can go ahead and replace hello world with the actual component. So component name is range slider. Let's go ahead and create our component, and we'll create our component range slider.js in the component directory. And we go ahead and create our React component. And within our React component, let's go ahead and create a h1 tag. And within that h1 tag, we'll have range slider. And back to our index.js file, we can go ahead and import that range slider. And as you can see, our component is working perfect. We can see range slider now displaying in the browser. Next thing we'll do, we'll go ahead and add a class to our main div. The class basically set up our minimum height would be the screen, and we have a background color of green, right? So that is using the Tailwind CSS classes. If you notice, we also place item center and be using grid, so we have our h1 tag display in the center of the screen. Okay, so let's continue. In our range slider component, let's go ahead and give it a class of flex. We're going to set it up so that we have flex column. We're going to use a background color of white and a shadow of XL. We're going to create our rounded corners. So rounded corners will be large, and we're going to create some padding of 6. Right, so padding X would be 6, and then the padding Y would be 4. We'll also add some CSS class, some Tailwind class, to make our text bold. So as you see, we have text 3XL and font is bold. The text color is gray, and we have a margin bottom of 1. Alright, so below that, we'll create a p tag and we'll add the text. Use the slider or enter minimum and maximum price. So let's see how that looks. That looks good. Let's go ahead and apply a class. And the font, we make it semi-bold, and the text, we make it large. The text will also be gray of 700. Right, back to our slider component, we add a div, and we give it a Tailwind class of flex. We also justify between, and items are centered with a margin y 6. And within that div, we'll go ahead and create a next div, and that div will have rounded corners. So we'll have rounded as medium, and then we'll have our input button, or input field, sorry, and that input field will be of type number. We'll also assign a class of width of 24 and rounded borders. And on change, we want to set the minimal value to our target value. So far, that's what we have here. And next, we're going to create the actual slider. So we create our division, and within that, we'll create our slider. So let's go ahead and give that div a class name with it some Tailwind classes of margin bottom of 4. So we're going to create some spacing after our input fields. Okay, and let's go ahead and add a div within that. And then make that div tag relative. So our slider is really an input type. So we're going to create that input, and we're going to name it type, and we're going to give it range. Again, the value, we're going to set it at minimum value, and then we're going to create a next input field, and this one will be setting it at the maximum value. Right, so at the top, let's go ahead and set up our progress bar, and this will show us the amount between the maximum and minimum, and we're going to make it green, so it will be a small 1 pixel bar showing us the range that we have selected. right? So for this, we're going to use useState, and we're also going to use useEffect, and we're also going to be using useRef. So let's go ahead and input that from React. Let's create a constant. We name it progress_ref, and we're gonna assign useRef to it, and we're passing a null value into useRef. Let's set up a onChange handle function. So on change, the function handle max will be triggered, and on change, for the next input, we'll have handle minimum. All right, so let's go ahead and set up our functions. All right, if we save, of course, we'll get an error because we haven't defined that function. So let's go ahead and define our functions. Handle minimum, and we're gonna equal that to a arrow function, and let's go ahead and do the same for maximum. So we say const handle max is equal to a arrow function, and we actually pass in the event as a parameter. Right, so let's go ahead and save again, and that should clear up our issue. Even if we haven't defined the function as yet, we haven't defined the how the handle minimum and handle maximum will work, but actually we get our error out. Okay, good. Right, so for range or slider, we can set the minimum, and we can set that to, for now we can set that to 0. For the hard coding the values, now step, you can set it to, let's see, 10. And the maximum, we can set it to 10,000. Right, and we need to do the same thing for the next input. So we can copy that. Let's go ahead and add our reference. So we see ref is equal to the progress ref, which we have defined.
So what we'll do, instead of hard coding those values like minimum and maximum and the step value, instead of hard coding it into a component, what we will do, we will pass it in to a component. So let's go to the index file, and here we'll go ahead and pass in those parameters, or those props as they are called. So we can pass those values in. And what we can do is go ahead and change our hard-coded values to the values that we passed in. So let's go ahead and do that. So you see now nothing changed. Our slider remains the same. We have the minimum of 0, the maximum of 10,000. So that's good. We didn't have any break-in changes. So let's create our side effect using use effect. So this is our function here that will basically tell the CSS how far to go. So basically it tells the CSS how much of the green line we want to see. So let's go ahead and pass in our initial minimum and also our initial maximum. Okay, so good. Let's go ahead and check. So everything looks good. So we can see our slider now adjust itself to the maximum and the minimum. Okay, good. So if we change the minimum value and we check our component, we'll see that it should reflect it. Let's go ahead and refresh it a bit and see. Right, and we see that the minimum value is 500. Okay, let's change that back. So we're good. That means our component is working. All right. All right, so let's handle this slide. So we're gonna handle what happens when you slide using the minimum or the maximum adjustments on the input fields. All right, so we're checking whether our maximum value minus the minimum value is more than or equal to the price cap, and the maximum value is less than the max. Right, so if the value that is passed in our slider is more than the maximum value, then we should run some function here, or else we're going to set the maximum or the minimum value to the value of the slider, right? Or else we're going to check if the value on the slider is less than the minimum value, and if that is the case, we go in and we set in the minimum value to the target value. All right, so let's see if that works. Let's move it. So okay, we have no movement here, so let's see. All right, let's go for handle maximum, and let's go ahead and say if the maximum value minus the minimum value is more than or equal to the price cap, and the maximum value is less than or equal to the max, then we check if the target value of the slider is less than the minimum value, or else we set the maximum value to the target slider value, right? Or else then we check if the slider input is more than the maximum value, and if that is the case, then we set the maximum value to the target value. Right, so let's see. So so it should work here. All right. Okay, so that looks good, but we just need to have the actual little knobs. We should be able to move those little knobs with our mouse. So let's see how that works. So let's set up our maximum value here. So whenever the maximum value change, it updates our state. So what we're going to do here, we're going to add a CSS. So you're going to add a CSS selector here for input range. We set the pointer to auto, and the height to 24, the border radius to 50%, and we can do WebKit transparent, good none, and we're applying a background color of green. So let's see. Save that. Let's try moving our sliders, and now we have our sliders moving. All right, so everything looks good here.